The cattle car doors screeched open, revealing sunlight that felt alien after 3 days of darkness. Ingrid Weber clutched her torn Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform, her blonde hair matted with sweat and fear. Around her, dozens of other German women blinked in the harsh American daylight, their faces etched with the terror that propaganda had promised them. They had been told stories, whispered tales in bunkers about American savagery, about prisoners disappearing into unmarked graves, about violations too horrific to speak aloud. The radio broadcasts had been clear: capture meant death, or worse. Ingrid's commanding officer had handed out cyanide capsules just weeks before the surrender, his hands shaking as he spoke of honor and the inevitable end. Now, stepping onto foreign soil, Ingrid expected jackbooted thugs with snarling dogs. She expected rifle butts and screaming commands. Instead, she found herself facing young American soldiers who looked barely older than her 22 years, their uniforms clean and pressed, their weapons held casually rather than threateningly. But it was the smell that stopped her cold. Bacon. Rich, smoky, impossibly luxurious bacon drifting on the morning breeze. Ingrid's stomach, empty for 2 days, clenched with sudden shameful hunger. Behind her, she heard Greta Hoffmann gasp, a sound caught between disbelief and desperate longing. Bacon was a memory from childhood, from Sunday mornings before rationing, before the war consumed everything. "Mein Gott," whispered Anna Kruger, the oldest among them at 35. "They're cooking breakfast." The American sergeant approached their group, clipboard in hand, his expression more bored than hostile. He spoke broken German, mispronouncing every other word, but his tone carried no malice. "Willkommen, a welcome to Camp Liberty. You will be processed, processeered, and fed." Fed? The word hung in the air like a promise too dangerous to believe. As they were marched through the camp gates, Ingrid caught glimpses that shattered her expectations. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows, their windows actually glazed with glass. American guards lounged against fence posts, some reading newspapers, others sharing cigarettes and quiet laughter. No one was being beaten. No screams echoed across the compound. The only sounds were ordinary: boots on gravel, distant conversation, and that maddening sizzle of pork fat in iron pans. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely enjoying what you're seeing here. The processing line moved with bureaucratic efficiency rather than cruelty. Names were recorded, photographs taken, belongings catalogued. When Ingrid's turn came, the young corporal behind the desk looked up with curious eyes rather than hateful ones. "Sprechen Sie English?" he asked, hopefully. When she shook her head, he simply shrugged and continued his paperwork, occasionally glancing at her as if she were more puzzle than prisoner. The barracks assignment came next. Bunk beds with actual mattresses, thin but clean windows that opened. A small table where someone had left a few wildflowers in a tin cup. Ingrid sat heavily on her assigned bunk, her mind reeling. Where were the torture chambers? Where were the mass graves her officers had described? The lunch bell rang at precisely noon, its tone sharp and clear across the compound. Ingrid followed the other women toward the mess hall, her steps hesitant, her heart hammering. This would be the test. This would reveal the Americans' true nature. Inside the hall, steam rose from serving stations where soldiers in clean aprons ladled food onto metal trays. Real food: potatoes, bread that looked almost white, vegetables that hadn't been stretched with sawdust, and there, sizzling in enormous skillets, strips of bacon that sent waves of aromatic impossibility through the air. Ingrid accepted her tray with trembling hands, watching in stunned silence as an American private barely 18, with freckles and kind eyes, placed 2 strips of bacon alongside her potatoes. He smiled at her, a genuine expression devoid of mockery or threat, and said something in English that she couldn't understand but somehow felt like an apology for not speaking her language. She found a seat at one of the long wooden tables, surrounded by women whose faces mirrored her own confusion. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the scrape of forks against metal and the occasional involuntary whimper of pleasure as starved bodies encountered real nourishment. Ingrid raised the first strip of bacon to her lips. Her hand shaking, the taste exploded across her tongue. Salt, fat, smoke, richness, beyond anything she'd experienced in 3 years of war. Tears sprang to her eyes, hot and unexpected. She thought of her brother Hans, buried somewhere in the frozen hell of Stalingrad. She thought of her mother, who had died clutching turnip peels during the Berlin bombardment. How could the enemy feed them better than their own Reich had? The first week passed in a haze of disorientation that no amount of bacon could ease. Each morning brought the same impossible routine: reveille at 6, orderly lines for washing, breakfast served by enemy soldiers who said good morning in broken German and actually seemed to mean it. Ingrid found herself studying these Americans with the intensity of a field biologist observing a new species. Private Johnson was perhaps 19, with sandy hair and a gap-toothed grin. He worked the breakfast line, serving oatmeal and coffee, real coffee, not the burnt barley substitute that had passed for the beverage during the Reich's final years. When Ingrid approached his station each morning, he would attempt a cheerful Guten Morgen that came out sounding like Guten Morgen, then laugh at his own pronunciation. The sound of his laughter, completely free of malice, created a knot of confusion in Ingrid's chest that tightened with each passing day. Historians still debate whether the American POW feeding programs were motivated purely by Geneva Convention compliance or represented a deliberate psychological strategy. What remains undisputed is their effectiveness in undermining Nazi propaganda among captured personnel. By the second week, conversations began to emerge among the women, hushed discussions during evening hours, voices barely above whispers as they grappled with cognitive dissonance that threatened to reshape everything they thought they knew about the world. "My training officer told us Americans ate their own dead," murmured Greta one evening, her voice hollow with shame. She stared at the remains of her dinner: pork chops, mashed potatoes, green beans that still held their color. "He said they were cannibals who worshipped money instead of the fatherland." Anna Kruger, the former communications specialist, shook her head slowly. The radio broadcasts spoke of torture chambers, of prisoners forced to fight each other for scraps of moldy bread. Yet yesterday, I watched 2 guards share their own lunch with a sick woman in the infirmary. Ingrid said nothing, but her mind churned with similar contradictions. She remembered the final briefing before her unit's capture, when Captain Muller had shown them photographs allegedly depicting American atrocities, images that now seemed suspiciously staged, conveniently lacking in verifiable details. The third week brought an unexpected addition to their routine: a visit from the camp chaplain, Father O'Brien, an Irish-American priest whose German was surprisingly fluent. He gathered the women in the main hall for what he called voluntary spiritual guidance, though his true purpose became clear within minutes. "I understand you've been told certain things about American soldiers," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I understand you may be confused by the treatment you've received here. This confusion is natural. When what we've been taught conflicts with what we experience, the mind struggles to reconcile the difference." Some women looked away, uncomfortable with this direct acknowledgement of their internal conflict. Others leaned forward, hungry for any explanation that might make sense of their situation. "I won't tell you what to believe," Father O'Brien continued, "but I will tell you this: every American soldier in this camp has a mother who packed his belongings when he left for war. Everyone has a sister, a sweetheart, a friend back home who prays for his safe return. They are not monsters. They are young men doing their duty, just as you were doing yours." The silence that followed was deafening. Ingrid felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking entirely, but developing hairline fractures that would spread with time. The fourth week brought letters. Not from home. Germany's postal system had collapsed along with everything else, but from American families who had volunteered to correspond with POWs. Ingrid's letter came from a woman named Margaret Sullivan in Ohio, who wrote in careful elementary German about her farm, her 3 children, and her hope that the war's end would bring peace to all families, both American and German. The letter included a photograph, Margaret standing beside a red barn, her children gathered around her, all of them smiling into the camera with the unconscious ease of people who had never known real hunger or fear. Ingrid studied the image for hours, searching for signs of the decadence and moral corruption her political education had promised she would find in American faces. Instead, she saw only ordinary happiness. That night, lying on her bunk, Ingrid listened to the sound of American guards making their rounds outside. No barked orders, no crashing boots, just the steady rhythm of men walking their posts with professional calm. Through the window, she could see the camp's perimeter lights creating pools of yellow warmth in the darkness. She thought about the bacon again, not just its taste, but what it represented. In the Reich, bacon had been a luxury reserved for party officials and their favored supporters. Here, it was served to prisoners of war without ceremony or comment, as if feeding one's enemies well was simply the natural order of things. The contradiction was becoming unbearable. Either everything she'd been taught about Americans was a lie, or this elaborate kindness was itself a deception of unprecedented sophistication. Both possibilities terrified her in different ways. As sleep finally claimed her, Ingrid's last conscious thought was a question that would haunt her dreams. If her enemies were capable of such humanity, what did that say about the cause she had served? The announcement came during morning formation, delivered by Colonel Richardson in his characteristic blend of authority and unexpected gentleness. "Ladies, beginning tomorrow, we will be offering educational programs, English lessons, basic literacy courses, and what we call civic instruction. Participation is voluntary, but encouraged." Ingrid exchanged glances with the other women, seeing her own mixture of curiosity and suspicion reflected in their faces. Education had been a weapon in the Reich, carefully controlled, meticulously filtered to serve the state's purposes. What kind of learning would their captors offer? The makeshift classroom occupied what had once been a storage building, now furnished with wooden benches and a blackboard that bore the chalk dust ghosts of previous lessons. Miss Catherine Walsh, a Red Cross volunteer from Boston, stood before them with the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to working with reluctant students. "Today we begin with something simple," she said in accented but competent German. "The English word for freedom. Can anyone tell me what this word means to them?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a grenade. Freedom was a concept the Reich had redefined beyond recognition. Freedom from democracy's chaos, freedom from individual choice's burden, freedom through absolute obedience to the state. But here, in this enemy classroom, the words seemed to carry different weight. Greta raised her hand tentatively. "In German, we would say Freiheit, but I'm not certain we mean the same thing." Miss Walsh nodded thoughtfully. "An excellent observation. Words can mean different things to different people, can't they? In America, we believe freedom means the ability to choose your own path in life, your work, your beliefs, even your criticisms of government." Anna snorted softly. "Criticize the government? That would be treason." "Not in America," Miss Walsh replied calmly. "In America, criticism of government is considered a civic duty. We believe democracy grows stronger through debate and disagreement." Historians continue to examine whether these re-education programs violated international law regarding prisoner indoctrination, though most scholars conclude they fell within acceptable bounds of providing educational opportunities. The English lessons proved surprisingly addictive. Ingrid found herself looking forward to the daily sessions, drawn not just by the language itself, but by the ideas embedded within it. English seemed to contain concepts that had no direct German equivalent, words like privacy, which described individual space that even government couldn't violate, or dissent, which suggested disagreement could be patriotic rather than treasonous. But it was the film presentations that truly shattered her remaining certainties. The first screening took place on a Thursday evening, the projector's mechanical chatter filling the mess hall as images flickered to life on a makeshift screen. What followed was footage from liberated concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. The camera moved methodically through scenes of systematic horror, emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood, survivors who looked more skeletal than human, ovens still warm with human ash. Ingrid felt the blood drain from her face. Around her, other women gasped, wept, or simply stared in stunned silence. Some muttered denials under their breath, propaganda, lies, staged atrocities designed to break their spirit. But the footage was too raw, too detailed, too obviously authentic to dismiss. The narrator's voice continued with clinical precision. These camps operated throughout German-occupied territory for over a decade. Conservative estimates suggest 6 million Jewish civilians were murdered, along with hundreds of thousands of Roma, disabled individuals, political prisoners, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. Lies, whispered someone behind Ingrid, but the word carried no conviction. When the lights came back on, Miss Walsh stood before them without speaking for a long moment. Her face held no accusation, no triumph, only profound sadness. "You served your country," she said finally. "You did what you believed was right. But this is what your leaders did while you served. This is what happened while you were fighting what you thought was a just war." The weeks that followed brought more films, more documentation, more evidence that the Reich they had served was built on foundations of systematic evil. Maps showing the camp network's vast scope, testimonies from survivors speaking in voices stripped of everything but truth, documents bearing official seals that proved the horror's bureaucratic nature. Ingrid began keeping a journal, writing in English to practice the language and perhaps to distance herself from thoughts too painful to think in German. The words came slowly at first, but with growing fluency. "Today I learned about the American Constitution. It says the government exists to serve the people, not the other way around. I don't understand how this could work, but Miss Walsh says it has worked for almost 200 years. She showed us newspapers from America where writers criticize their own president. No one is arrested for this. I cannot imagine such a world." The reading materials multiplied: books about democracy, copies of the American Declaration of Independence, even novels that depicted ordinary people making moral choices without government guidance. Ingrid found herself particularly drawn to a book called To Kill a Mockingbird, struggling through its English prose to follow a story about courage and justice in civilian life. But perhaps the most unsettling education came through simple observation of their captors. She watched Private Johnson help an elderly German woman write a letter to her surviving relatives, his patience infinite, despite the language barrier. She saw Colonel Richardson personally ensure that a sick prisoner received medical attention that rivaled what Wehrmacht officers had received. She witnessed guards sharing their own cigarettes with homesick prisoners, asking for nothing in return. Each act of unexpected kindness chipped away at the ideological certainties that had sustained her through 4 years of total war. If these were the actions of a morally bankrupt people, what did that make the system she had served? One evening, as she practiced writing English sentences by lamplight, Ingrid found herself composing words that would have been unthinkable months earlier. "I begin to understand that we were the ones who were lied to. We were the ones who believed in evil while calling it good." The question now is what to do with this knowledge. The routine had become dangerously comfortable. Morning réveil followed by breakfast, where Private Johnson now greeted Ingrid by name, stumbling through Guten Morgen Ingrid with endearing determination. Work assignments that felt more like occupational therapy than forced labor, mending clothes, helping in the kitchens, organizing supplies with a methodical efficiency that satisfied her German sensibilities. Afternoon English lessons where she found herself raising her hand more frequently, hungry for knowledge that had been forbidden for so long. But comfort in captivity carried its own poison. Lying on her bunk each night, Ingrid was haunted by mathematical impossibilities that refused reconciliation. The bread served at breakfast was whiter and softer than anything she'd eaten during the war's final 2 years. The coffee was real, the meat portions generous, the vegetables fresh enough to retain their color and vitamins. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond these protective fences, her people scraped survival from rubble and ash. Anna Kruger had taken to weighing herself on the camp's medical scales, documenting her steady recovery from the malnutrition that had plagued her final months of service. "I've gained 12 pounds, she announced one evening, her voice carrying shame rather than relief. 12 pounds, while Bremen starves. The camp newspaper, produced weekly by a collaboration between American staff and prisoner volunteers, became another source of internal conflict. The articles discussed reconstruction efforts, Marshall Plan aid proposals, democratic reforms being implemented across occupied Germany. But between the lines, Ingrid read statistics that made her stomach clench: infant mortality rates in German cities, tuberculosis outbreaks among civilian populations, elderly people freezing to death in unheated apartments. She was eating better as a prisoner of war than her own people were eating as supposed victors of their own liberation. The irony deepened during a particularly comfortable evening when Colonel Richardson organized what he called a cultural exchange program. American soldiers shared stories from home, while prisoners were encouraged to discuss their own backgrounds. Ingrid found herself describing her childhood in Bavaria, the alpine meadows where she'd picked wildflowers with her sister, the Christmas markets that filled winter evenings with warmth and light. Corporal Martinez, a Mexican-American from New Mexico, listened with genuine interest, asking questions about German traditions with the curiosity of someone who collected cultural experiences like treasures. When she mentioned her sister's death during a bombing raid, his face crumpled with authentic sympathy. "I'm sorry," he said in careful German. "War is hell for everyone." The conversation continued past lights out, conducted in whispers through the fence that separated the women's compound from the guards' quarters. Martinez told her about his family's ranch, the cattle drives that marked seasonal rhythms, the grandmother who made tamales that could cure homesickness with their aroma alone. His stories painted America not as the industrial wasteland of Nazi propaganda, but as a place where people lived ordinary lives filled with small joys and familiar sorrows. Historians note that fraternization between guards and prisoners, while officially discouraged, occurred frequently in American POW camps and significantly accelerated the denazification process among captured German personnel. But these human connections only intensified Ingrid's internal warfare. How could she reconcile the kindness of individual Americans with the bombs that had reduced German cities to moonscapes? How could she balance her gratitude for decent treatment against her guilt over receiving it while her compatriots suffered? The answer came during a Red Cross visit in late summer. Representatives toured the camp, documenting conditions for their reports to Geneva. Ingrid watched them interview prisoners, photograph the facilities, inspect the kitchens where bacon still sizzled each morning, their clipboards filled with evidence of American compliance with international law, proper nutrition, adequate shelter, medical care, educational opportunities. That evening, she overheard 2 Red Cross officials discussing their findings with Colonel Richardson. "Exemplary conditions," one said. "Perhaps too exemplary," Some critics argue you're treating prisoners better than displaced German civilians. Richardson's response was measured, professional. Our mission is to demonstrate American values through our actions. We believe treating prisoners humanely serves both moral and strategic purposes. When these women return to Germany, they'll carry first-hand knowledge of American character. Strategic purposes. The phrase hit Ingrid like a physical blow. Her comfortable captivity wasn't just humanitarian. It was calculated, deliberate, designed to reshape her worldview through the insidious power of consistent decency. Yet even understanding the manipulation didn't diminish its effectiveness. She still looked forward to English lessons, still felt genuine affection for Private Johnson's linguistic struggles, still found herself defending American democracy in late-night discussions with more skeptical prisoners. The bacon had been more than food. It had been the first weapon in a campaign for her mind and soul. 3 months into her captivity, Ingrid received her first letter from home. Written by a neighbor who had survived Bremen's destruction, it painted a picture of desperation that made her comfortable bunk feel like a betrayal. Families burning furniture for warmth, children begging for crusts of black bread, elderly people disappearing during harsh nights and being found frozen in doorways come morning. We heard rumors that prisoners in American camps are treated well, the letter concluded. We hope this is true, but we also hope you remember those of us who were not so fortunate. That night, Ingrid couldn't finish her dinner. The pork chops that had become routine luxury suddenly tasted like accusation. She pushed her tray away and walked to the compound's edge, staring through the wire at the American flag that flew above the administration building. Tomorrow there would be another English lesson, another opportunity to practice the language of her captors. Tomorrow Private Johnson would butcher another German greeting and smile at his own incompetence. Tomorrow the bacon would sizzle in familiar pans, filling the air with the aroma of an abundance that her people couldn't imagine. And tomorrow she would have to decide whether comfort in captivity was its own form of treason, or whether surviving long enough to carry uncomfortable truths back home was the most patriotic act she could perform. The cattle cars that carried them home bore no resemblance to American transport. Wooden slats leaked autumn rain through gaps that hadn't existed when the Reich still controlled rolling stock maintenance. Ingrid pressed her face against the cold metal, watching a landscape that seemed alien despite its geographical familiarity. Germany had become a nation of stumps, broken church spires reaching toward gray skies like accusatory fingers, factory smokestacks standing alone amid rubble fields where entire districts had once thrived. The train passed through what had been Cologne, now reduced to geometric patterns of destruction that resembled abstract art more than human habitation. "Mein Gott," whispered Greta, her breath fogging the window. "There's nothing left." But it was the people that shocked them most. Figures moved through the ruins like ghosts, their clothing patched and repatched until original fabric became archaeological mystery. Children with hollow cheeks and ancient eyes scavenged through debris piles, competing with rats for anything remotely edible. Women who might have been 30 looked 60, their faces carved by hunger into premature geography of suffering. Ingrid touched her own cheek, feeling the restored flesh that American meals had provided. Guilt settled in her stomach like lead. The displaced persons camp outside Hamburg served as their re-entry point into German civilian life. Processing tables manned by British and American officials documented their release, while German volunteers attempted to match returnees with surviving relatives. The volunteers themselves looked like scarecrows animated by stubborn will rather than adequate nutrition. Weber Ingrid called a clerk whose spectacles were held together with tape. "Family status?" "Unknown," Ingrid replied, her voice barely audible. "My mother died in an air raid. My brother was lost at Stalingrad. I have no information about other relatives." The clerk made notes with a pencil stub, that had been sharpened down to its metal ferrule. There's a refugee center in Munich. They might have records. Here's your transit authorization and food voucher. The food voucher represented one day's official ration: black bread made with sawdust filler, turnip soup, and ersatz coffee that tasted like burned acorns. Ingrid stared at the meager allotment, remembering breakfasts in Camp Liberty, where bacon and real coffee had been served without ceremony or rationing. The train to Munich crawled through a landscape of systematic destruction, stopping frequently to navigate around bombed bridges and twisted rail lines. Passengers shared what little food they possessed, their generosity made more poignant by its obvious cost. An elderly man offered Ingrid half his bread ration, his kindness undimmed despite obvious malnutrition. "You look healthy," he observed, with surprise rather than resentment. "Were you in a camp?" "American prisoner of war facility," Ingrid admitted, her words heavy with shame. The man's eyes widened. "Ach, you were fortunate. We heard stories that the Americans fed their prisoners well, better than we were fed at home." The conversation died in uncomfortable silence. Munich existed as a geography of absence. Ingrid recognized street patterns from her youth, but the buildings that had defined those streets had vanished into neat piles of sordid rubble. Crews of women worked methodically through the debris, passing bricks hand to hand in human chains that stretched across entire city blocks. They called it Trümmerfrauen. The rubble women and their labor represented Germany's only hope for eventual reconstruction. The refugee center occupied a partially damaged school building, its windows covered with cardboard and its heating system reduced to wood-burning braziers that provided more smoke than warmth. Hundreds of displaced persons filled every available space, their possessions reduced to whatever could fit in a single satchel or worn on their backs. Ingrid found space on a bench beside a woman her own age, whose hollow cheeks and prominent ribs marked her as a veteran of the home front's final desperate months. "I'm looking for information about the Weber family from Munich," Ingrid explained to the volunteer coordinator. "My parents lived on Marienplatz before the bombing." The coordinator, a thin woman whose elegant accent suggested aristocratic origins, consulted records kept in composition notebooks. Marienplatz suffered direct hits in July 1944. Few survivors. There's a Weber family listed among refugees relocated to Augsburg, but no way to confirm relations. That evening, sharing thin soup with strangers in the shelter's communal dining area, Ingrid listened to conversations that painted a picture of national devastation beyond her imagination. Families separated across hundreds of miles, children orphaned and fending for themselves in ruined cities, entire communities simply erased from existence. "The worst part," said a middle-aged teacher, whose school had been converted into a hospital before being bombed, "is the silence from the East. No word from relatives in the Soviet zone. It's as if they've vanished into another world." Historians estimate that between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe following the war's end, creating a refugee crisis that persisted well into the 1950s. An old man at the next table overheard their conversation. "My nephew was captured by the Americans," he said. "Wrote from a camp in Texas, said they played baseball, had libraries, ate meat every day. Can you imagine, meat every day while we fought over potato peels?" Ingrid's throat constricted. She thought of the baseball games she had watched through Camp Liberty's fences, American soldiers and German prisoners playing together on Sunday afternoons. She remembered the library, where she had discovered American literature, the books that had opened windows into ways of thinking that her education had never acknowledged. "It's difficult to believe," she managed. "Oh, it's true," the old man continued. "The Americans even sent him home with new clothes and $50, 50 American dollars, more money than most of us have seen since before the war." That night, Lying on a straw mattress in a room shared with 12 other women, Ingrid stared at the ceiling where water stains created abstract patterns in the darkness. Around her, the soft sounds of weeping mixed with prayers whispered in dialects from across the former Reich. She reached into her small bundle and withdrew the items that connected her to her months in captivity: an English-German dictionary, given to her by Miss Walsh, a photograph of the American farm family who had corresponded with her, and a small notebook filled with English vocabulary words written in her careful script. The contrast was unbearable. She had been fed, educated, treated with respect and dignity by the very people her government had taught her to hate. Meanwhile, her own people had endured systematic starvation, bombardment, and displacement while she learned to conjugate English verbs and debate the merits of democratic government. Tomorrow she would continue searching for surviving family members, adding her voice to the millions seeking connection in a shattered world. But tonight, listening to the quiet desperation that surrounded her, Ingrid faced a truth more uncomfortable than hunger or cold. She missed the enemy, who had treated her better than her homeland ever had. 5 years after her release, Ingrid Weber stood in the kitchen of her small Munich apartment, preparing breakfast for her husband Klaus and their infant daughter. The morning routine had become sacred: real coffee purchased with Deutschmarks that carried actual value, white bread from a bakery that operated regular hours, butter that wasn't mixed with sawdust to stretch supply. The smell of bacon rose from the pan, and Ingrid froze. Even now, the aroma transported her instantly to Camp Liberty's mess hall, to the bewildering kindness of captors who had fed her better than her own country ever had. Klaus, a former Wehrmacht soldier who had spent 3 brutal years in Soviet camps, emerged from their bedroom adjusting his tie for another day at the construction company where Germany's reconstruction employed thousands of former soldiers. "Smells wonderful," he said, kissing her cheek. "Where did you find bacon? The butcher said it wouldn't be available until next week." Ingrid couldn't answer immediately. The bacon had come from the American commissary where she worked as a translator, part of the ongoing occupation administration that governed their transformed nation. Her fluency in English, acquired during those strange months of captivity, had become her most valuable skill in a world where former enemies had become rebuilders and allies. "The Americans had extra," she said finally, a truth that carried more complexity than Klaus could understand. He had tried to comprehend her experiences during those conversations that couples must navigate after war's end, when survival stories replace love letters as the foundation of renewed intimacy. But Klaus's captivity in Soviet labor camps bore no resemblance to her months in American custody. His stories featured systematic brutality, deliberate starvation, guards who treated prisoners as barely human obstacles to quota fulfillment. When Ingrid described bacon for breakfast and English lessons, Klaus's face would tighten with something that wasn't quite disbelief, but wasn't acceptance either. "You were fortunate," he would say, his tone carrying implications that neither of them examined too closely. Historians continue to debate whether the differential treatment of German POWs by various Allied powers was strategically planned or emerged from cultural differences in military administration and legal interpretation. The radio crackled to life as Klaus finished his breakfast, bringing news from Berlin, where the Marshall Plan continued transforming Western Germany from defeated enemy to essential ally. American dollars flowed into reconstruction projects, while former Wehrmacht officers were quietly recruited for a new military organization designed to counter Soviet expansion. The Cold War had transformed Germany's relationship with its former enemies with disorienting speed. Americans who had bombed German cities now provided aid for their reconstruction. Soviets who had been wartime allies now represented existential threats requiring Western protection. Ingrid listened to the broadcast while washing dishes, her mind processing the ironies that ordinary Germans navigated daily. The very Americans she had been taught to hate as subhuman monsters were now welcomed as protectors against the Soviet system that had once been their ally. Her work at the commissary provided front-row seats to this transformation. American officers who might have supervised her imprisonment now relied on her translation skills for dealing with German contractors and civilian officials. They treated her as a professional colleague, their casual respect a stark contrast to the deference demanded by Nazi authority structures. Colonel Richardson had visited the commissary the previous month during an inspection tour. Now a brigadier general, he had aged into the kind of authority that commanded respect through competence rather than fear. When he recognized Ingrid, his face had lit with genuine pleasure. "Miss Weber, I remember you from Camp Liberty. You were one of our most dedicated English students." The conversation that followed had been cordial, professional, even warm. Richardson inquired about her family, congratulated her on her marriage, asked about her work with obvious interest in her well-being. When he left, he shook her hand like an equal and thanked her for her service to the reconstruction effort. That evening, Klaus had been quiet during dinner. "He seemed very familiar with you," he had observed. His tone carefully neutral. "He was my camp commander," Ingrid replied. "He encouraged education programs and treated prisoners according to international law." Klaus had nodded, but she could see him struggling with concepts that didn't align with his own experiences of captivity. In Soviet camps, commanders were distant figures who appeared only to announce increased quotas or investigate sabotage. The idea of personal relationships between captors and prisoners, of education programs and cultural exchange, belonged to a different universe from the one he had inhabited. The baby began crying from the nursery, and Ingrid went to retrieve little Anna, named for the communications specialist who had become her closest friend during captivity. Anna Kruger had married an American soldier after the war, emigrating to Ohio, where she now sent cheerful letters describing suburban life that sounded like something from the Hollywood films that played in Munich's reconstructed theaters. Holding her daughter, Ingrid stood at the window overlooking a street where construction crews worked to rebuild buildings destroyed by the very people who now provided aid for their reconstruction. The psychological complexity was staggering, learning to trust former enemies, while maintaining wariness toward former allies, accepting help from those who had defeated you while preparing to fight alongside them against those who had supposedly liberated you. The bacon finished cooking, its smoke carrying memories that would never fully fade. Ingrid served Klaus his portion and watched him eat, this man who loved her despite not entirely understanding her, who shared her bed but not her particular collection of wartime ironies. After Klaus left for work, Ingrid sat at her kitchen table with a cup of real coffee and opened her English dictionary, the same one Miss Walsh had given her years ago. She still practiced the language daily, maintaining skills that had become professionally valuable but remained emotionally complicated. In the margins of the dictionary, she had written notes to herself in English, observations that felt safer in a foreign language. Memory is a luxury that defeated nations cannot afford. Gratitude to enemies is the most uncomfortable emotion. Sometimes the kindness of strangers is harder to bear than their cruelty. The American commissary bell rang in the distance, calling her to another day of translating between worlds that remained fundamentally incompatible despite surface cooperation. She would help American officers communicate with German officials, facilitating relationships that served both nations' interests while privately marveling at the speed with which absolute enemies had become indispensable allies. But first, she finished her breakfast, tasting memory and irony in equal measure, wondering if her daughter would ever understand the world that bacon represented, a place where enemies fed you better than friends, where captivity offered more freedom than loyalty, where the greatest battles were fought not with weapons, but with simple acts of unexpected decency. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing and sharing. These forgotten perspectives deserve to be remembered. Until next time, take care.